I know I'm not exactly known for this kind of thing, but I'm going to start this video off with a somewhat controversial hot take, so just know that going in. But the Space Marines are actually kind of badass. And I promise you that means a lot coming from me. I am a die-hard Chaos and Xenos fanboy. And although the Astartes are objectively awesome, for some reason the designers of Warhammer 40K thought that 8-foot-tall, roided-out space dudes clad in power armor, taking off into the galaxy to purge it of heretics, witches, and mutants wasn't quite awesome enough. Thus, we were given a whole bunch of different types of Space Marines that kicked their ridiculousness up into a completely different strata. We got ourselves some Vampire Space Marines, Mystical Space Mummy Space Marines, Zombie Space Marines, and wouldn't you know it, we even got Space Marines. But personally speaking, as a big fan of all things spooky, one of my favorite variants of the Space Marines has always been the Werewolf Space Marines, better known as the Wulfen of the Space Wolves. These are Space Wolves that have given themselves over to their inner beast and become absolute monsters in close combat, that rip and tear their way across the battlefield, slaughtering everything that gets in their way. I've always been fascinated by the lore of the Wulfen, but when I started doing serious research for this video, I found out that it's actually super complicated and convoluted, and their story's actually been retconned like a whole bunch of times. This has left them in somewhat of a mysterious state, and most people don't actually know the full story behind them. Like, what exactly are the Wulfen and where do they come from? What happened to that super mysterious 13th Great Company that is said to be comprised almost exclusively of Wulfen? And what was that whole thing about the Wulfen returning in Warzone Fenris, even though any Space Wolf at any time can turn into one? Well, today we're going to be getting to the bottom of that and a whole lot more. But before we do, did you know you can actually play as the Space Wolves in Warhammer Tacticus now? They just released their second character, and if you somehow missed the first one, he's actually a Wulfen that you can add to your squad. They're the sponsor of this week's video, so a quick shout out to them, and then we're going to dive headfirst into the Grimdark.
I am absolutely obsessed with just about everything Warhammer, whether it's reading the books, building and painting the models, or playing the amazing tabletop game. But as all my friends will tell you down at the local game store, ever since it became my job to make lore videos, I just don't have as much tabletop gaming time as I used to. But now because of Warhammer Tacticus, I can scratch that itch for some grimdark gameplay whenever I want. The big news this week is that Tacticus is releasing its second Space Wolf champion, Tajark, the Hound of Morkai pack leader, in a new hero release event starting on May 7th. I got to play around with this guy recently, and I can say for sure he's definitely going to be shaking up the meta with his grapnel launcher. Not only does it do a big chunk of physical damage to the target, but it pulls them out of position and sends him flipping over their head into an adjacent space. And as we all know, Space Wolves are not fans of witches, and he exemplifies this by dealing bonus damage to Psykers, as well as reducing the damage they deal back to him and his squad. The game is absolutely chock full of legendary heroes and iconic units from the grimdark future, with an art style that makes the heroes in-game look nearly identical to their tabletop counterparts. Tacticus has tons of different game modes, from arena battles, guild raids, to multiple dedicated campaigns. And what I love most about this game is just how simple it is to learn, while maintaining a high skill ceiling for seasoned players. The new hero release event has just started, so it's a perfect opportunity to start playing Tacticus and unlock Tajark for yourself. You can download the game for free right now by scanning the QR code on screen or by following the link in this video's description. Big thanks to Warhammer Tacticus for sponsoring this video. If I really had to think about it, my favorite thing about the Space Wolves would be their dual nature, the constant internal and external struggle they face on the day-to-day. The life of a Space Marine is one of constant warfare, where duty and honor are not just goals in which to strive for, but are one's entire reason for existing. Every action they take, every enemy they face, and every victory they earn is done in the name of the Allfather and the protection of mankind. But wherein the external observer only sees them as a pack of instinctive hunters sworn to the life of endless violence, they are not privy to the internal war that is fought within each and every Space Wolf. The constant, never-ending battle to maintain control over their own souls and fight back the beast within. One single momentary lapse in judgment, a tiny step off the path of discipline, or a single instance of weakness can see them regress into a primal, frenzied state as their mind and body twist and contort into a form better suited to a feral jungle predator rather than the peak of human perfection that is the Astartes. When this happens, they become a deranged and frenzied monster that is what we refer to as a Wulfen, basically a hulking werewolf-like creature clad in Space Marine power armor. And between you and me, of all the things a person could potentially end up in combat with in the grimdark future, a Space Marine and a werewolf both sound pretty horrifying, but the two of them wrapped into a single nightmare entity is a whole nother story. The Wulfen are absolute monsters on the battlefield. All of the predatory instincts of a Space Wolf are heightened to ludicrous degrees, and they are overcome with a frenzied bloodlust that is never satiated. They gorge themselves on the blood and fear of their enemies as they rip and tear through the ranks of their foes, gore and viscera flying in every direction as they savagely lash out at everything within arm's reach. Needless to say, when a Space Wolf loses himself to the Curse of the Wulfen, it's an incredibly dangerous situation, and not just for the enemy, but for his allies as well. However, in many instances, a Wulfen can be captured, controlled, or they're able to regain just enough of their sanity to make for some of the most terrifying shock troops ever utilized by the Adeptus Astartes. But to really get a good understanding of what the Wulfen are, we need to know about the Wulfen curse that affects all of the Space Wolves. And although it is referred to as a curse, the defect has its roots in science and genetic engineering, more so than warp-based sorcery. You see, all of the Space Marines that exist within the 42nd millennium are created with what is known as gene seed. Now, I've talked about this a lot in other videos, so I'll keep it brief. A gene seed is a catch-all term that includes a lot of different organic and synthetic elements into a genetic cocktail, used to take a regular mortal human and elevate them into the transhuman perfection of the Astartes. The gene seed used for every Space Marine legion and/or chapter, depending on what time period you're talking about, is derived from the Primarch associated with each of them. Because each of the Primarchs are vastly different from one another, this in turn grants their sons a host of different blessings unique to that particular chapter. But you can't just separate the good from the bad, and in a lot of cases, this genetic cocktail comes with a whole host of negative traits as well. These can range from the peculiar and inconvenient, like the Imperial Fist's inability to properly use the Belcher's gland, thus preventing them from spitting acid like other Space Marines, to the full-blown super cancer that afflicted the Emperor's children, the vampiric red thirst of the Blood Angels, or the flesh change of the Thousand Sons that saw them turned into gibbering abominations. With the Space Wolves in particular, the gene seed used in their creation is known as the Canis Helix, or the Spirit of the Wolf. This gene seed is derived from their Primarch leman Russ, and it gives the Space Wolves their characteristic canine physical features, such as elongated incisor teeth, as well as enhanced sensory acuity and drastically improved reaction time. Many of them sport an animalistic and somewhat savage appearance, as well as an aggressive temperament that many have described as feral in the heat of battle. There's a ton of benefits to the Canis Helix. It makes the Space Wolf some of the mightiest combatants within the entirety of the Astartes, as well as making them incredibly potent hunters and trackers. And I know what you're thinking. It doesn't really seem like there's much of a downside here, other than maybe being a little bit hairy, and maybe a Space Wolf mead hall smells more like a kennel than a tavern you'd actually want to spend some time in. An easy trade-off to make for someone whose life is dedicated to constant war in the name of the Allfather. But there is definitely a pretty big trade-off here, especially considering that the Imperium doesn't tend to hold mutants in very high regard. You see, that never-ending battle that wages in their souls that I mentioned before is not just a figurative turn of phrase. It's not just that they're Space Wolves and there's a lot of wolf symbolism in the Legion, and thus they're fighting against a personification of the quote-unquote beast within. Quite the opposite. It is in fact semi-literal here, as the Canis Helix infects each and every one of them with a genetic code that, if subconsciously activated by the Space Wolf, they will quite literally turn into a werewolf-like creature. The genetic material coursing through their body will constantly test their discipline and encourage them to give into their nature, to become the beast they were always meant to be, to rip and tear their way through their enemies in a savage, animalistic, gore-drenched frenzy. This is incredibly difficult for them to resist, and in fact, conquering the beast head-on is one of the first trials an aspirant will need to pass in order to be initiated into their ancient brotherhood. Even if an aspirant is successful in this, even if they manage to resist the call of the wolf, that animalistic hunger will always be part of them. It never goes away, and all too often in the heat of battle, whether out of survival or the bloodlust just boiling to a breaking point, even the mightiest of Space Wolves can end up giving in. And it's in this moment that their body twists and contorts, their incisors grow larger, their muscles bulge under their armor, they take on a more canine-like appearance, and they lose themselves to their savagery. Although there have been a handful of Space Wolves who have been able to overcome this transformation after it's taken control, the reality is most will never be able to change back. The once noble and disciplined protector of mankind has now become nothing more than a savage, deranged monster, destined to hunt not just the enemies of mankind, but all those they have sworn to protect. In order to get a better understanding of this, let's talk a little bit about how the Space Wolves are created. All of the different Space Marine chapters have different ways in which they recruit new aspirants, and the Space Wolves are no exception. Each and every one of the young men taken from the Fenrisian tribes that would be chosen to join their ranks must first be tested by their priesthoods to be suitable in mind, body, and spirit. These tests can take thousands of different forms and are absolutely ruthless, designed to weed out the weak. Thus, the vast majority of aspirants will fail and never progress to any of the real trials. Each of those actual trials can also take a lot of different forms in each of the great companies, each designed to test the young Fenrisian man's wit, courage, and strength. If the aspirant is able to survive the grueling months of test and training, then they'll be forced to undergo 2 final tests, one for each of the Great Wolf of Fenrisian myth's heads. The first trial will see the aspirant taken to a chamber deep beneath the Fang, where he will stand in front of a vast portal crowned with the wolf god's face and surrounded by rivers of lava. The warrior must be able to pass through the portal and unflinchingly face whatever or whoever waits for him on the other side. To show even a moment of hesitation is tantamount to admitting weakness or deceit. This is seen as the individual lacking the purity of heart and purpose for life, something the wolf priests will not allow to go unpunished. To step beyond the portal is to open one's mind entirely to the rune priests, leaving no secret hidden and no thought unchallenged. They will scour their soul for doubt, impurity, and buried temptation, anything that could possibly be used against him in the future by the alien, the witch, or the heretic. Only one who is able to steel himself against such horrors is worthy to be called a son of Russ. What each and every warrior encounters on the other side of the portal is unique to the individual, and no 2 accounts are exactly the same. But most commonly, the aspirant will find himself faced with impossible odds in a number of conjured scenarios. They will be utterly convinced that whatever they're witnessing is in fact reality, and will react accordingly based on their heart's true intentions. This will all be done in full witness of the rune priests, and if they find them wanting, they will never be permitted to wake from this fever dream, as their mind will be completely scrubbed and their bodies will be handed over to the Iron Priest to be made into servitors. Those who are proven to be pure of heart and intent will move on to the final trial, known as the Test of Morkai. This test will see the aspirant be taken out into the frozen hellscape of Fenris, with nothing but the clothes on his back, or in some instances, the aspirant may be forced to endure the trial naked. They will be given the first dose of the Canis Helix, which he imbibes by drinking it from the cup of the Wulfen. This is by far the most critical component in the process of turning into a Space Marine, as all of the other genetic augmentations that they'll receive throughout the process will be rejected by their body without it. However, conversely, this is also potentially the most toxic and dangerous element that will be introduced to their body. The Canis Helix is frighteningly potent and has claimed the lives of countless aspirants. However, the true death toll will most likely never be known, as the Sons of Russ very rarely record failures. Those who survive the process of absorbing the genetic cocktail will undergo a monstrous transformation. Now, the Helix works by aggressively altering the warrior's mind and body. Their body mass swells and their teeth grow into sharp fangs. Their bones split and buckle before fusing back together, thick hair sprouts all over their body, and they're overcome with an undeniable desire to hunt, kill, and gorge themselves on fresh meat. Whilst in the throes of this excruciatingly painful change, the aspirant is left alone in the wilderness with the primary objective of making it back to the Fang, the Space Wolf's fortress, alive. This is a lot easier said than done, as Fenris is a ridiculously dangerous place and they're going to be facing sub-zero temperatures. But survival's not the real objective. The real objective is to overcome the beast that is rampaging through their body and mind, to resist its call to endlessly hunt, and to maintain enough control to accomplish their mission. Most will inevitably fail, and will remain a feral wolf-like creature, sentenced to stalk the woods of Fenris as a Wulfen for the rest of their lives, or conversely, be captured and caged by the men they had hoped to stand beside as brothers, set to live a life in bondage until the time is right to be released on the battlefield, not as an esteemed warrior of the Velka Fenrike, but as a living weapon. If they, however, manage to overcome the transformation and the horrifically dangerous trek back to the Fang, they will be implanted with the remainder of the Space Wolf's gene seed that stabilizes the Canis Helix, thus completing their apotheosis, and preparing their body to receive the rest of the genetic implants of the Space Marines. Even though every single one of the Space Wolves that we read about in the stories has undergone this terrible rite of initiation and subsequently conquered their inner beast, the beast itself will always be there, always tempting them to give in to its hunger. And in a moment of great battle frenzy, they may just end up reverting back into the monster they thought conquered, the curse living on in every single one of Russ's sons. It's important to note that if this transformation does occur, there have been Space Wolves that have been able to reassert control over their mind and body. Once all of their enemies lay dead, the pounding rush of blood in their ears becomes less deafening, and the scent of their prey's fear has died away. This is admittedly incredibly rare, and the vast majority of the time, if a Space Wolf gives in to the Wulfen that lives in their soul, there's no going back. With great sadness, their brothers would have to put them down, their death serving as a grim reminder of the reality of their existence to the rest of their brothers. I will point out that these more drastic measures were taken primarily in the early days of the Space Wolves, whereas later on in 40k, the Space Wolves would be much more familiar with the Wulfen curse, and thus do have some systems in place to monitor their brothers and make sure the curse isn't allowed to fully take hold of them. It's actually one of the primary roles of the chaplain equivalents within the Space Wolves known as the Wolf Priests. Individuals that are said to be wolf-bitten or suffering from aspects of the curse are traditionally given over to the Wolf Priests to be closely monitored and make sure it doesn't progress to the breaking point. When we talk about the Wulfen, there are two major groups of Space Wolf that come to mind, the 13th Great Company and the Wolf Brothers. I'll touch on the Wolf Brothers briefly because there's not a ton of information on them, but quite simply, they were the first successor chapter of the Space Wolves after Guilliman decreed that all of the legions be broken up into chapters shortly after the Horus Heresy. After they were created, they were given half of the Space Wolves' resources, including half of their weapons, armor, vehicles, etc., etc. It was to be a test, and if successful, the Space Wolves planned on creating a long line of successor chapters, supposedly enough to challenge the 500 worlds of Ultramar, and they would take planets around the Eye of Terror enough to completely encircle it. Unfortunately, things didn't go according to plan, as the Canis Helix within the Wolf Brothers proved to be incredibly unstable. And because of this genetic instability and the overabundance of Wulfen-like mutations, the Wolf Brothers would end up being disbanded, and no subsequent attempt at making a Space Wolf successor chapter would happen for thousands of years until the Wolf Spear Primaris chapter was created. On the other hand, we have the 13th Great Company, which is perhaps far more famous and mysterious. It was one of the original 13 Great Companies formed by Leman Russ before the coming of the Emperor. Now, when the truth of his legacy was finally revealed, and the Emperor decreed he join him and the Imperium, the warriors that had fought beside King Leman demanded they be allowed to continue to do so. This, however, would require them being elevated into Space Marines, something that, unfortunately for the Greybeards of the 13th Great Company, would be incredibly difficult as they were all far too old. Knowing the risks, they still demanded Leman allow them to attempt the procedure, and not having the heart to deny these men that had sworn themselves to him, the Wolf King allowed it. Now, tragically, most did not survive, but those that did would come to make up the core of the 13th. After they had all become Space Marines, the Space Wolves would be familiar with the Wulfen, as every single one of them would have to face off against it during their trials. The 13th Great Company, however, was the first to witness the curse coming back in full effect, which ended up claiming 2 of their warriors. This all took place in Leman Russ's Primarch novel, The Great Wolf. And I'm going to share that passage with you, because not only does it give a really good representation of what it's like for the Space Wolves to see their brothers turned into these feral monsters, but it also serves as a great bit of foreshadowing for what would end up happening to the 13th Great Company. Bolter-burst cadavers lay everywhere, slumped over sensor terminals, sprawled across a deck ankle-deep in blood, jammed down into radial trenches where spilled cables spat and sparked. 3 Scarabine mech suits had been ripped apart, and now lay in an intermingled heap close to the command throne, their limbs torn free and hurled across the bridge's interior. Bolvi was guarding the throne, bolter drawn, as were most of those Yoren had placed under his command. The wolves were no longer advancing, but fanning out warily, all of their attention focused ahead, to where the sensor pits gave way to a wide raised area running down to the very end of the observation dome.
What happened here?
Yoren voxed, coming alongside his Huskarl. Bolvi was breathing hard, the sound strained from behind a gore-stained helm face.
Haral,
He replied, gesturing with his bolter muzzle. Yoren looked out and understood. Haral had been a Fenrisian, one of the first inducted into the Legion after the Allfather's coming to the Ice World. He had not been one of the Dektra's honor guard, the elders who dared the Helix well past the years deemed possible by Imperial sages, but was fresh taken from the flows, as pure a fighter who had ever endured the trial of Ashaheim. He had flourished in the Crusade, taking to the rounds of murder with relish and joy. He was popular with his battle brothers, a candidate for elevation within the Legion, the epitome of a son of Russ. All that had gone. He stood alone, out ahead of the others, panting in a slurred mess of sputum-flecked bile. His helm had been ripped off, revealing a shaggy mess of hair and extended fangs. His right gauntlet was also gone, and in its place was a clawed fist clutching the head of a Delanian crew member. The rest of his armor was more red than gray, covered now in a thick sheen of glistening viscera. He had fallen into a stoop, one hand pressed against the deck, and his eyes shone with a bestial illumination. His pupils no longer focused on anything in the room, but darted back and forth, as if he was surrounded by a host of unseen enemies.
How long?
Asked Yoren grimly.
It started in the hall.
Said Bolvi, keeping his bolter trained on Haral.
Another one too, Bial hook knife, though they cut his thread on the way up.
Bolvi's voice was dark. Such was not a good death. It was tainted, made possible only by a madness born of the deepest nightmares of a singular world.
How many did he take?
Bolvi snorted a low laugh.
Most of them. Those 3 mech suits, all of them too, one by one.
Yoren looked at the creature that had been Haral. It was twitching now, its eyes moving more violently, scoping out danger. Its face was changed, stretched into the jowly mass of a true beast's maw. Its nostrils flared and sniffing. Slowly, it began to advance, creeping back towards the line of 6th Legion warriors.
Haral,
Yoren called.
stand fast!
The creature halted, swinging its head from side to side, snarling and spitting saliva in yellow loops.
You defeated this.
Yoren told it, moving carefully ahead of the line of his battle brothers.
Remember, you passed through the madness. You'd remain the man.
The Haral creature growled, sinking lower, its armor-clad haunches shivering. Blood dripped from its underbelly, running down the gunmetal outlines of its Legion Astartes iconography. It seemed to recognize Yoren then, focusing blearily on him and baring its fangs, hissing like a feline. Yoren stopped moving. He did not aim his weapon. It was not the first time he had seen such a transformation, but never before had he seen it go so far. To witness it made him sick to his soul.
It can be overcome,
he said, hoping fervently that it was true.
You can slay it, just as you did before.
Haral blinked. For a moment, comprehension flickered and the slavering stopped. The creature seemed to become aware of what was around it, not the dark pines of the Fenrisian wilds, but the sight of his own rampant slaughter orgy. Its wretched breathing became frenzied, and it reared back up on 2 legs, a look of horrific agony imprinted on its features, and howled. Yoren heard the click of bolter clips loading.
No!
He ordered, remaining isolated. But it was too late. Haral charged at the Jarl, bounding towards him with claws out, its face twisted into a deathly mask of flesh-stretched madness. The bolters opened up, slicing through its outstretched arms and blasting armor chunks free. Incredibly, it kept on coming, roaring in pain and confusion, somehow shrugging off the impacts even as its body was shot through again and again. Yoren never moved. The Haral creature collapsed at his feet, destroyed in the hail of bolt rounds, its body leaking a slick of heart's blood. Yoren knelt down, stooping to grip the monster's head in his gauntlets. It was barely breathing then, just a thick wheeze that clotted and bubbled in a burned-out throat. Yoren looked into its eyes, searching for something, anything, just a remnant. All that reflected back at him was agony. Animal agony, bereft of intelligence or self-awareness. Yoren extracted himself, reached for his own bolter, and placed the tip of the muzzle against the creature's temple.
Forgive me,
he breathed, and squeezed the trigger. The round exploded on impact, ending its torment. This was an incredibly tragic moment for the wolves, and they didn't really know what to make of it. Upon further inspection after the fact, they weren't able to detect any trace of warp sorcery or physiological cause for the transformation. Thus, they decided it was in the company's best interest to keep this event secret until they had more information. The next time we would hear from the 13th was during the Battle of Prospero, wherein the Space Wolves invaded the Thousand Suns homeworld. They don't really explain how this happened, but at this point Bolvi Greybeard has now become the Jarl of the 13th. After the fighting was done, and Magnus the Red enacted his pact with Tzeentch to teleport himself and the remaining Thousand Suns on the planet away to safety, Leman Russ determined that their battle was finished. Prospero had been razed, and with the Civil War engulfing the Imperium, the Space Wolves would be needed elsewhere. All of the Space Wolves would end up leaving Prospero, except for the 13th, who had mysteriously vanished without a trace. The exact reason for the disappearance was left intentionally mysterious. Now, some believed Leman Russ had sent them on a secret mission, whereas others believed they may have just tragically met their end here and been entirely wiped out during the Battle of Tisca. The more prevalent rumor was that they had gone off into the warp in pursuit of the fleeing Thousand Suns. The Space Wolves of the 41st millennium never really knew the truth of what had happened to the Lost Great Company, and thus the 13th sigil in the Grand Annuals within the Fang would be replaced by an obsidian stone that came to represent all of the great companies in the chapter's history that had disappeared or been destroyed in battle. However, in the audio drama The 13th Wolf, we get to witness firsthand what exactly happened to the 13th Company shortly after their reported disappearance. Basically, what happens in this story is that during the fighting on Prospero, Bolvi and the 13th are in pursuit of a particularly powerful sorcerer of the Thousand Suns named Issachar Orr, as well as the warband under his command. This pursuit ends up leading them on a maddening chase through a bunch of different portals. Now, at first the portals lead to different areas of Tisca, the capital of Prospero where the majority of the fighting was taking place. However, as Bolvi and his men go from portal to portal, the destinations become stranger and stranger. At one point, they straight up end up somewhere out in the warp, where a bunch of shadowy flying creatures try to ambush them. They retreat back into the portal, and instead of ending up where they had originally been, are now in a strange network of underground tunnels. They would not be deterred by this foul sorcery, as they had sworn to King Leman that no Thousand Sun would be allowed to live and escape their vengeance. However, after going through one of the strangest portals of all, they end up in a crystalline labyrinth, wherein their reflections in the mirrored hallways begin to contort into feral wolf-like creatures that suddenly burst out of the glass and attack them. Bolvi and his men manage to escape by the skin of their teeth by breaking through the glass and plummeting into the void below, where by the time the darkness fades away, they realize they are in a giant domed building, surrounded by tons of Thousand Suns and space wolves frozen in combat. Not all of the members of the 13th managed to escape with them, however, as many were still trapped in the labyrinth, and many more had gone through different portals after they had split up multiple times. Suddenly, the sorcerer they had been pursuing finally reveals himself and begs them to stop. By jumping from portal to portal, they had been doing an enormous amount of damage to the fabric of space and time. The sorcerer claimed he would willingly surrender to get them to stop barbarically dashing through them. The sorcerer even opened up 2 different portals, one that led deeper into the warp-based network of the labyrinth, and another that would teleport them all back safely to Tisca, where him and his men would surrender. Bolvi refused, as he had sworn to King Leman that all would face his judgment. He pulled out his plasma pistol and blew a hole right in the sorcerer's chest. With the sorcerer's dying breath, he spit blood on the Space Wolf's feet and closed the portal back to Tisca. The 13th Great Company had no choice but to continue through the portal and back into the labyrinth. From Bolvi's perspective, this is the option he would have taken anyways, as the majority of his men were still missing, and there were more Thousand Suns that had escaped. Bolvi leads the charge into the final portal and tells his men,
We were not born for easy deaths, my wolf brothers. Embrace wherever it leads, and spare none the blades of retribution.
This was the last that anyone would hear of the 13th Great Company for 10,000 years, until their re-emergence in Warzone Fenris. It was on the hive world of Nereides, where Harald Deathwolf and his great company would find themselves fighting off against an enormous horde of demons that had subsequently spawned to torment the planet from an infernal warp rift. In the final battle against the creatures of chaos, the Deathwolves found themselves outmatched. They were trapped in a noose that was quickly tightening around their necks, and the demons were pressing in from all sides, while flamers of Tzeentch rained down flaming warp fire from above them. All hope seemed lost until suddenly a bunch of shadowy figures were glimpsed fighting the demons on the rooftops. Massive figures leapt from the rooftops and slammed into the demon horde with clawed limbs swinging. Harald Deathwolf was momentarily at a loss for words as he witnessed the huge bestial terrors splattered head to toe in demonic blood, tearing into his enemies. The Deathwolves rallied to the fight with a newfound vigor as the two forces hacked and slashed their way through the remaining demons. There could be no mistake, although they were much larger than a standard Astartes, these creatures were without a doubt warriors of the Velka Fenrica. After the fighting was done, all eyes turned to the newcomers, who, even hunched over, were looking down at the Lord of the Deathwolves. Their long, powerful limbs and broad chests were barely encased in ragtag power armor, while their faces were lupine and bestial. Harald saw intelligence behind their amber eyes and recognized a twisted echo of his own features in those of the beast before him. The thing that truly made his twin hearts beat faster, though, was the faded insignia on the warrior's armor. It was unmistakable. Beneath millennia's worth of scratches and dents, there was a Fenrisian symbol not seen in 10,000 years. Twisted and monstrous though they undoubtedly were, the newcomers bore the heraldry of the 13th Great Company. Their leader marched towards Harald and kneeled before him. He put one hand on its shoulder and beckoned him to rise. The creature did as it was instructed, and though his voice was slurred and snarling, he responded with, "We are brother. We are Wulfen." Weeks after this incredible discovery was made by the Deathwolves, Chapter Master Logan Grimnar gathered his wolf lords within the Fang to debate the return of the Wulfen. What did the return of the 13th Company mean, and what was to be done about it? Grimnar revealed to his wolf lords that the warp storm that had produced the demons, as well as the Wulfen in question, had not been an isolated event. Multiple more of them had opened up from the world of Atropan to Femnir. There seemed to be a pattern to their locations, and the Wulfen pack leader, who called himself Yngvir, had repeated over and over that more of his brothers would be coming, and to search for them on the wings of the storm. Ulrich the Slayer was convinced that the coming of the Wulfen was an omen that Leman Russ himself would be returning soon, whereas Gunnar Redmoon shouted him down, demanding to see proof of the claim. Kjell Grimblood agreed that it may be an omen, but possibly one of a much darker sort, whereas Egil Ironwolf questioned whether they knew that these creatures were really the Wulfen kind, and if so, was their bestial form some terrible perversion of the Canis Helix, or a doom that all Space Wolves faced in time? Eric Morkai growled that it didn't matter so long as they could serve as a suitably deadly weapon, whereas Bran Redmaw surged to his feet enraged, demanding to know whether Iron Wolf thought the same of his famously savage war packs. And on it went, the Wolf Lords arguing amongst themselves until finally Ragnar Blackmane stated that it didn't matter whether the Wulfen were a gift or a curse. The first priority must be to gather them swiftly before anyone else did. Should the Inquisition or even some of their brother chapters encounter the returned Wulfen, they would undoubtedly draw uncomfortable conclusions about the Space Wolves. Although this statement was met with snarls from the other Wolf Lords, they eventually admitted that Ragnar spoke the truth. Their top priority now would be to recover their Wulfen brothers and treat them as honored Fenrisian warriors, unless the truth proved them to be otherwise. It was a slim chance, but perhaps these newcomers would even be able to lead them to their long-lost Primarch. And so it was that each one of the great companies would set out targeting one of the warp storms. And sure enough, at the heart of each of those storms, each of those companies discovered a planet that in fact had Wulfen on it. For the Space Wolves, their primary mission was the recovery of the Wulfen. They would engage in battle with the demons when necessary, but they weren't here to purge the world of warp filth. They were to get in and get out. However, the warp storms had not only drawn the attention of the Space Wolves, but also that of the Dark Angels and Grey Knights. Now, neither of them knew what the Space Wolves were up to, but the Grey Knights, who had been monitoring the warp storm activity, would eventually journey to the world of Fimnir, where they clearly saw signs that Astartes had been there, finding dead demons and spent bolter casings. When they finally discovered one of the corpses of the Wulfen, they were immediately suspicious of the Space Wolves and decided that they would need to speak with Logan Grimnar in person. Likewise, on the world of Tranquilitas, the Dark Angels and the Space Wolves showed up at roughly the same time. Now, the Wolves rushed to get to the Wulfen first, but unfortunately by the time they arrived, the Dark Angels had captured them in a stasis field. The Angels demanded to know what they were and what the Space Wolves wanted with them, but all that they would tell them was that they were fellow battle brothers and they needed to relinquish them to them. The Dark Angels refused, saying they would instead bring them to the Inquisition. Now, this was an incredibly tense moment, but it ended up getting cut short when a horde of Slaaneshi demons attacked and disrupted the stasis field. Now, this next moment is incredibly important for the entire storyline of Warzone Fenris, which we're not going to be covering here. We're mostly just going to be focused on the part the Wulfen played in this. But the Space Wolves lunged forward, igniting their jetpacks, and each and every one of them grabbed one or two of the members of the Wulfen, before using their packs to escape from the Dark Angels, who were forced to fight off the incoming demons. From the Dark Angels' perspectives, the Space Wolves had just put the lives of mutants above fellow Astartes, and even worse, they had abandoned them to die at the hands of the demons. The Sons of the Lion swore that they would pay for their crimes. But again, this is all more part of the whole Warzone Fenris thing, which requires a much longer video, so we're just gonna move on. So okay, as each of the companies rounded up all of the Wulfen from different areas of the galaxy, they would bring them back to the battle barge known as the Cold Fang, that waited in the Anverheim system. The purpose of the Space Wolves that had been stationed on the barge was to rearm the rescued Wulfen for their triumphal return back to Fenris. The Wolf Lords would come in, drop off the Wulfen they had found, and then go back out to look for more of their lost kin. At first, everything was going according to plan. The Iron Priests were successfully equipping the 13th Company brothers with Hrothgar Swordfang's newly adapted armor and weapons that would better fit them. You see, the Wulfen didn't seem to really enjoy using, or even perhaps fully understanding how to use, some of the more complicated weaponry, such as power weapons or chain weapons. Most of them had been equipped with either a form of punch dagger or simply relied on their teeth and claws in combat. However, as something strange began to happen, the more and more Wulfen began to pile in. As their numbers grew, so too did their restlessness. So much so that the alpha pack leaders of the Wulfen began to struggle to control them. Numerous servitors and even a handful of crew members ended up getting seriously injured or killed by the Wulfen that lashed out at random. And more alarmingly at the same time, the Grey Hunters tasked with watching over them became even more quarrelsome and aggressive than usual. Tempers flared, curses were hurled, and bloody fistfights broke out on the decks of the ship. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, almost to the point of turning into outright anarchy. Every single Fenrisian knew that the Curse of the Wulfen could seize one of their brothers in the heat of battle, even going so far as to transform them in extreme cases. On the Cold Fang, however, it seems as though the curse symptoms were manifesting in every single warrior at the exact same time. Several succumbed altogether, their minds snapping and their bodies devolving into a form indistinguishable from their newfound 13th Company brothers. It got to the point where the mortal crewmen were the only thing keeping the ship under control. Harald Deathwolf had warned the other Wolf Lords that he had a bad feeling about this all along, that maybe this behavior was not restricted to the warriors aboard the Cold Fang. And this would be confirmed when dozens of reports started to come in from the other Wolf Lords, reporting unruly behavior and increased aggression amongst the packs. He believed the Wulfen were not a boon, but a curse. To make matters worse, the Grey Knights had eventually met up with Grimnar, and after a brief yet intense standoff, wherein the Grey Knights demanded he hand over the Wulfen and he refused, they eventually decided to set the matter aside for now, as there was something far more pressing to attend to. They informed him that Fenris was under attack. Logan would send out the call for all of the companies to abandon their quest and return to Fenris. As more Space Wolves returned to the Coldfang, the situation on board would eventually be gotten under control. And when Grimnar was confronted about the situation by the other Wolf Lords, he refused to heed the Death Wolf's warning. Their priests had conducted every test imaginable, and there was without a doubt no chaos taint to their long-lost brothers. But even if that was true, the other Wolf Lords insisted that something was definitely amiss, perhaps a sickness that they didn't yet know of. The Wulfen were definitely having some kind of effect on all of the other Space Wolves. Grimnar said that it didn't matter. They were their brothers. They would head for Fenris and the Wulfen would fight by their side. Which ultimately is exactly what happens. The Space Wolves returned to the Fenrisian system and with the help of the Wulfen, managed to fight back the invasion. Frustratingly, these books don't actually give us a lot of answers on the nature of the Wulfen, the 13th, or what exactly is happening with them. But we do get to see multiple battle scenes wherein younger members of the Space Wolves witness the Wulfen fight, and even though up until that point they've never shown a single sign of turning into one, they go full-blown Wulfen right then and there, letting out a blood-curdling howl, only to be met with a howl in response from their new packmates in approval. The book seems to indicate that the Curse of the Wulfen has grown much stronger ever since the 13th's return, and has potentially become contagious. Even the Primaris Marines, who at first showed little indication that the genetic defects of their legions would take hold of them, have proven over time to not be immune to the Wulfen curse. Perhaps Ulrich was right, and the return of the 13th was in fact heralding the return of Leman Russ, but as another one of the Wolf Lords ended up pointing out to him, that would mean this was the Wolf time, the end of all things. So although the return of Leman would be met with great joy from his sons, it would be under disastrous circumstances. Over the years, more and more Wulfen would appear from different warp storms, and in the novel Ashes of Prospero, a group of Space Wolves would even venture into the Portal Maze to recover Bolvi Greybeard and the Old Guard that had been lost during the Battle of Prospero, of which they are ultimately successful, but they don't inform him and the men under his command that although more and more of the 13th have been located over time, that they have all succumbed to the Curse of the Wulfen. Ultimately, there are still a lot of mysteries surrounding the Wulfen and their return that I hope get fleshed out in the near future. Are they truly an omen of the return of Leman Russ? Or are they the destiny that all Space Wolves will eventually face? What do you think the return of the 13th actually means? And do you think it's setting up some kind of future event in the 40K timeline? Let me know all of your thoughts in the comment section below because I absolutely love hearing from y'all. There is one more thing I want to touch on briefly before I end this video because I know people are going to ask about it in the comments. One of the earliest tellings of the Wulfen Curse's origins is a legend that says that the name is derived from a man named Wulfen, who was said to be a great warrior and was only ever beaten once in combat, and that was by Leman Russ himself, though Leman ended up sparing him because he believed him to be a noble warrior. When the time came for the men that followed Leman to become Space Wolves, and he offered them the Canis Helix, it was Wulfen who stepped forward first to drink the genetic cocktail. However, the spirit that guarded the Canis Helix could sense the deceit and treachery in Wulfen's heart. He had ultimately planned to betray Leman and stab him in the back. The Canis Helix rejected him and turned him into a feral monstrosity, his outside now matching the evil that lay in his heart. Even though Leman Russ slew him without hesitation, it was said that Wulfen's hatred lived on in the form of his curse that would forever tempt any who drank from the Canis Helix to go feral. I believe the origin of this legend comes from the Ragnar book series, which was in the early 2000s. And I'm just going to admit it to you, have not read those books. It exists as kind of a blind spot for me. But from the excerpts I've read of it, it seems like this legend is presented in those stories as being just that, a legend. And no one really knows the truth other than Russ himself. I'm of the personal belief that this isn't considered canon anymore as it was pretty early lore and tends to conflict with just about everything else about the Wulfen story. However, I'm also the kind of person that admittedly believes that everything is canon, just not everything is true, so I'm going to leave this one up to your own personal interpretation. Let me know in the comments if you think this legend is definitely true or not and why. Anyways, that's all I had to say on the Wulfen. This was supposed to be a much shorter video, and then in the course of my research, I found out their storyline was spread out over like 20 different sources, but just in small little snippets here and there. And I ended up having to put in way more research than I meant to. Anyways, that's all I had to say on the Wulfen, so I'll catch y'all in the next one.